Julie Frankel will introduce Gail Sheehy.
Gail Sheehy has written 17 books. Her earliest revolutionary book, Passages, which explored the predictable crisis of adult development, was named by the Library of Congress as one of the 10 most influential books of our time. In later books, including The Silent Passage and Sex and the Seasoned Woman, Gail dared to place a spotlight on taboo subjects, menopause, and the sexuality of older women. Gail was one of the original contributors to the New York Magazine. She has been a contributing editor to Vanity Fair since 1984. She's covered national and world leaders, writing about the character and psychology of men like Robert Kennedy, women like Hillary Clinton and Margaret Thatcher, and even Saddam Hussein. In her latest book, Daring, a memoir, Gail focuses the lens on her own passages, chronicling her trials and triumphs as a girl journalist in the 1960s, her magical love affair, and marriage to New York founder Clay Felker. I'd like to introduce Gail Sheehy.
Well, I'm so glad to be back in St. Louis. And before I begin, there's a question we need to clear up. I'm always asked, Sheehy, is that a Jewish name? Maybe not. So when I was asked this by the Jewish Book Council, they said, well, do you have any other Jewish connections? I said, well, as a matter of fact, I have 3 Jewish grandchildren and 1 brand new Jewish grandniece. So I was told, then you're a Bobby and a Tanta. So I'm very proud to be a Bobby and a Tanta. And as Julie said, I've spent many of the last 40, even 50 years interviewing hundreds and maybe thousands of women and men and asking them about the passages of their lives. And once I graduated to my 70s, I figured it was about time to turn the lens on my own passages. How did I do? Where did I mess up? Where did I recover? How did I get through all the barriers and the difficulties and the missed chances and the serendipitous chances that we all face as we go through adult life? Well, it took me 3 years to excavate my life, and I use that verb intentionally because it's kind of like pulling apart your ribs and digging in underneath there and, you know, finding some magical places and finding some dark places and finding some kind of empty spaces where you just don't know, well, what was I thinking about then? What happened at that point? And why did I make this move? And then it would take like several months to relive that period. Fortunately, I had kept daytimers, those old hand calendars, and being a writer, I would always scribble little notes and dialogue on the side, so I could actually piece together when things happened and in what sequence. So anyway, I encourage you to think about writing a memoir, if only for your grandchildren, because it is a wonderful experience of recovering your history and passing it on. Well, what is daring? Okay, I think, first of all, it's the curiosity to take the less traveled road. And it's the courage to say no to the status quo and to say there may be a better way. And it's also the bravery to say, when we're older and gray, I'm still here. So I want to ask you, was there ever a time when you did something that you'd never done before and you failed at it, but you tried it again, and maybe you tried it again? That's daring. And eventually, you dare forward, and you will learn something. Was there ever a time when you saw an injustice and you spoke up for a people or a person who didn't have a voice? That's daring. Did you ever cross a color barrier or an age barrier or a gender barrier. I'll bet every woman in this room crossed at least one gender barrier in your time. That's daring. And what do? You sit down and act as if you belong there. Well, I'm going to do a little different talk than usual authors. I'm going to tell some stories about daring moments of my life. I'm in my mid-20s. This gives you a little help. Remember the Farrah Fawcett hairdo? And I'm about to take the longest walk of my life. It starts from the flamingo pink precinct of the women's department at the New York Herald Tribune, which was where girl journalists in the 60s were always sequestered in the women's department. And I'm sneaking down the back stairs so my editor won't catch me, and across into the testosterone zone, the city room, where only men in white shirts and dark ties were allowed to work. And I could get fired for this. If my editor knew that I was going to take my best story to another editor, she would have thrown a fit. But I'm on a mission. I'm determined to pitch a story to the man who was changing journalism in the 1960s, the wunderkind editor Clay Felker. He was incubating New York Magazine in the pages of the Herald Tribune. But you know, girls in the 60s were just writing about beauty and baking and being the good wife. So I'm picking my way through the desks, and I see this guy with black Irish curls and smoke coming out of his ears, and he's banging away at a typewriter. It's Jimmy Breslin. Jimmy Breslin writes about bail bondsmen and hookers and hustlers and kneecappers. And I'm thinking, well, why can't I write about those kinds of things? And then on the other side of the room, there's Tom Wolfe, dressed like a Virginia gentleman with his long silky hair and his British haberdashery. I'd just run into him in the elevator and I said, Mr. Wolfe, what's it like writing for Clay Felker? Well, he said, the Herald Tribune is the main Tijuana bull ring for competitive male feature writers, but you have to be brave. I thought, well, I'm little, but I like to think I'm brave. So I kept on walking, and I got to Clay. My first exposure to the man who would become my mentor was his voice. It would make, you know, water jiggle in the cups. What do you mean you don't have my reservation? It's Clay Felker. Isn't this the Four Seasons? I want my usual table in the pool room. I'm bringing 3 for dinner tonight. A couple of senators, and my wife's opening on Broadway. Thinking, I'm going to pitch a story to this man who knows everybody in New York. He said, Mr. Felker? It's Clay. Where did you come from? Oh, the estrogen zone? Great. What have you got for me? I've got 15 seconds to spill out this story. Well, it's a story about loser guys, and they want to attract beautiful girls to share their beach house in Fire Island and sit on their beach blanket to attract other beautiful girls, you know, like flypaper, and they're having specimen viewing parties. Did you go to a specimen viewing party? Yes. They rejected me. Great. Then write it just like you described it to me. Write it as a scene. We'll call it the flypaper people. Write journalism as a scene? This had never been done before. It was always who, what, when, where, why. Just the facts, ma'am. But Clay was introducing me to something we came to call the new journalism, using techniques from fiction, characterization, scenes, dialogue, saturation reporting, involving ourselves in the story. So I wanted to take the leap, but I had to wait for another year. The night of the launch party of New York Magazine as an independent publication, big party at the Four Seasons, I couldn't go because my life at that time was on the Lower East Side, East 7th Street, in a 4th floor walk-up where I was taking care of my 2.5-year-old child. Well, I was closing the window, and I saw this limousine pull up on East 7th Street. We didn't have limousines. We had Ukrainian refugees. And a man in black tie steps out. My lookout on the first floor, Ukrainian seamstress, calls up, "A fancy man wants coming up. It's okay?" I said, "Okay." So up comes, in barges Clay Felker, brushes aside my daughter's toys and says, "Where were you tonight?" I said, "Well, I didn't have a babysitter and I don't have a gown." "Gail, what do you know about politics?" "Well, my mother's a natural-born bomb-throwing Irish rebel, and my father's a country club Republican, so I know about politics. It's about fighting at the dinner table." "Great, then you'll understand Bobby." "Bobby who?" "Bobby Kennedy. I want you to go out and cover his presidential campaign against Gene McCarthy in California and Oregon." "Me? But I've never written a political story." "Now's the time to start. I need you to leave in 2 days." But I can't, I mean, who will I, Gail, I want to tell you something. You'll never make your name as a journalist unless, if you keep on writing little stories, no matter how good they are, nobody's going to remember them. What you have to do is tackle a big story, something everybody's talking about, but they don't know the why. Well, that was the best career advice I ever had. And I vowed I would do it. So I got on the Bobby Kennedy campaign, but I couldn't get on the flights because the senior journalists all got to go. Until one day when the senator was making a yo-yo trip up and down the Cascade Mountains of Oregon in a little tiny plane through rain squalls. Well, I'm not too happy about flying in that kind of weather, but this is where I had to be daring. So I got on the flight, and we stopped in one rural town after another where we would be met by hostile crowd of men with guns over their shoulders, and I swear they'd have like a possum and a raccoon on either shoulder. And one guy actually said, grabbed Senator by the shoulder and said, "I've been waiting 2 hours to tell you, if I had saw a man like you in the White House, I'd shoot him." Kennedy would just get up on the courthouse steps, unprotected, face the crowd, and try to engage them in a friendly discussion about limiting the spread of guns. That was courage. He got back on the plane, and all of a sudden I heard, "Do you want to sit up here in New York?" New York, that was me. So I'm sitting next to Senator Kennedy, and he asks one of his aides to hand him JFK's overcoat. It was 5 years since President Kennedy had been assassinated, but his brother was still wearing JFK's clothes. It was a poignant moment. We talked about that and about these dangers. And as we were approaching Portland to land, terrible rain. We couldn't see it, but another craft was headed straight towards us. All of a sudden, our little craft dropped like a stone. Men were screaming, my stomach turned over, and in the middle of the drop, Senator Kennedy quips, "I knew Gene McCarthy was desperate. I didn't know he was that desperate." Well, that gave me the insight into Bobby Kennedy that made it a real story. He was a fatalist. He had seen so much death in his family that he knew he was a target, and he wasn't afraid. And 2 nights later, his own life was ended at the point of a gun. From the title of my book, you might think I was born fearless, but nothing could be farther from the truth. I'm a normally fearful person. I've even had a panic attack. So I had to find a way to use my fear to compel me to act. And I had to be willing to fail forward in order to take the risk of trying to do things I didn't know how to do until I learned how to do them. And if you think of it today, that's what the tech industry is all about. People fail, they try, they have a crazy idea, they fail, then they find a new partner, and together they come up with a successful idea. And there's a new biography of Steve Jobs, and that's exactly how Apple came to be born and came to be improved. So taking the trip with Bobby Kennedy was one of my first dares. And after a while, I began to realize that giving in to my fears was immobilizing. And I really feel weak and fruitless. But daring is action. And it changes people's reaction to you. And that changes your thinking about yourself. And it goads you to take a step further. And so I found it made me stronger. And I began to develop a habit. When I fear, I dare. And you can too. If you read about me in the positive reviews, and I hope those are the only ones you read, you might think to yourself, well, she just sailed right through. But actually, my career was almost run off the tracks before it got started. At 28, I was blindsided by divorce. I had put my husband through medical school, and I got a PhD degree. Do you remember those, putting hubby through? But it turned out he was unfaithful, a serial adulterer, and so I had to dare to leave the marriage to save my self-respect. And I had a 2.5-year-old daughter when I became a single mother, not by choice. And I found myself struggling like many young women I meet today, trying to balance my personal life and my life as a mom and building a career and earning a living. I had to scramble to pay the rent, working full-time at the Trib, but I really couldn't bear to leave my child with the kind of people I could afford to stay with her. And so I had to give up my dream job. But then I had to think, can I really afford to put myself out there as a freelance writer? I mean, I don't even really have a name yet. Will anybody take me seriously? Well, I could have given up and sold Tupperware on the side, but if I had, I knew that that little flicker of creativity would have died. And so I walked into the fear, and I wrote my first book, a novel called Love Sounds. It failed. Well, then what? Well, the funny thing about failure is you're out there and it often opens up other opportunities. So within a few weeks, I had a call from the famous producer and director, Otto Preminger. He wanted to make a movie of Love Sounds. Well, I had to say, oh, Mr. Preminger, that's very thrilling, but I have a now 4-year-old daughter, and could I bring her with me while we were working? He wanted to invite me up to his townhouse to write a screenplay, learn how to write a screenplay. And he said, little child, I don't know. We'll see. He was a formidable man. He was not a honey bear. So I brought Maura, and he picked her up in a hand the size of a baseball glove, lifted her over his head. His head was the size of a bowling ball. And she said, Mr. Preminger, you forgot the hair on top. He melted. She had him in the palm of her hand. And we worked together very happily for the next couple of months, and I learned how to write a screenplay. All was well until his studio found a way to unhook him from the contract with this unknown writer. But by then, New York Magazine was starting up as an independent, and I joined the family, one of the early women who was supported and mentored by Clay Felker, including Gloria Steinem and Nora Ephron and Barbara Goldsmith and Richard Reeves and Tom Wolfe and Pete Hamill, and we had this marvelous family, and we were doing something so cutting edge, the first city magazine in the country, and doing new journalism. So we really were very tight. And it was actually my work that made me daring. You might find it hard to imagine me pulling on hooker boots and blue suede hot pants to march up and down Lexington Avenue on the arm of an off-duty cop who was taking the part of my pimp so that I could get inside the story of violent prostitution rings that were then keeping tourists out of New York. And that developed into a book called Hustling and into a TV movie starring Jill Clayburgh in her first starring role. And you'd probably think it was brash of me to follow Hillary Clinton into the ladies' room at Renaissance Weekend, but the First Lady let down her hair. She said, "I'm being blamed for everything. I just don't know what to do anymore." She was being blamed for the midterm election defeat by the Republicans in '94. Not only that, she confessed, "I'm going through menopause." Even first ladies have menopause. But nobody was talking about that taboo word at that time. Even mothers didn't talk to daughters. And I had just written a book called The Silent Passage about menopause, which kind of broke open that forbidden word. So Hillary and I connected at a very human level. And after saying she didn't know what to do anymore, of course, being Hillary, she laid out her strategy to counteract male backlash. She said, "It's not me they hate, it's the changes I represent." Well, that encounter started me off on 10 years of writing about Bill and Hillary Clinton, their presidency and their after presidency, and ultimately writing a biography called Hillary's Choice. Would you ever dare to step out of your comfort zone, and I mean way out, to discover something about the world or about yourself? Well, I dare to insist that Clay send me to Northern Ireland at the peak of the Troubles. Why? Well, that's what you're always telling me. Why? Why is the British Army at the throats of the Irish Catholics? And we have to get the why. He said, "What does that have to do with New York?" Well, it seems like half the people in New York are Irish, but it's not about that. It's about the women. It's the women. All their men are in jail, and it's the women who are carrying on the fight. They're banging the bin lids to warn of raids, and they're even shooting British soldiers. Well, that sounds like a good enough story. Let's go. So imagine now, January 20, 1972, Northern Ireland, Derry, Sunday, Bloody Sunday. It happened so fast, I couldn't quite believe it. We were just walking down the hill in a peaceful civil rights march. We came to the center of town, to the barricades where the British soldiers were ready with throwing their tear gas at us. We vomited it back, and then we dragged those dented by rubber bullets to safety, and then everybody dropped back to the square at the Bogside, and people were just greeting their neighbors and having a lovely Sunday afternoon. But I noticed that there was a line of tanks around the perimeter of the square. I wanted to get a better view. So I climbed up an outdoor staircase and got out on a balcony so I could look down. And I was standing next to a young boy, maybe 14, and I was asking him, "How did the paratroopers fire their gas canisters so far?" Well, see them banging their butts against the ground, and all of a sudden, out of the blue, a bullet tears into his face. And his face turns into a bloody mess, and he drops at my feet. And I bend over him trying to think, how can I mend him? Because I was only 32, and up to that time, I thought everything could be mended. But he was bleeding, and all of a sudden, there were shots. And the man pulled me down, said, "Get down, crossfire." And the British soldiers, paratroopers, jackknifed out of their tanks and began peppering unarmed crowd with high velocity rifle fire. Then there were shots from the roof. It was the IRA sharpshooters. So we were caught in the crossfire. So what happened, I get to the boy, and then more people piled in on us, and we wound up like a caterpillar. We were inching on our stomachs up the outdoor staircase. Somebody has to push against the door and get us taken into safety. Well, I wasn't about to volunteer. And then, all of a sudden, a bullet passed just a few feet in front of my own nose. It was like stupefied. I just seemed like it stopped in midair. And I watched it embed itself in the brick wall. And then I did throw myself against the door, and we were taken in to safety. Well, not quite. The British Army was now kicking in the doors of the Irish Catholics, looking for arms or IRA. And this flat was owned by an old woman. She was playing the Long Cache prison song at the top amplitude. I said, "What are you going to do if the British Army comes in here looking for your son?" She said, "Lie on me stomach." So that's what we did. We laid on our stomachs. And about an hour later, when we went down, an IRA commander came over, said, "I'll have to take your film, lass." I said, "Well, you can take my film, but you can't take my tape recorder. It's been on the whole time, and it recorded everything." He said, "Good, lass, we'll use it in the World Court." And they did. I said, "Can you get me to a payphone?" So I called Clay, my one chance for survival, I thought. Clay's at home in bed in New York. We were living together by this time, watching television. He said, "How's the story coming?" Well, 13 people were just massacred here. "Wait a minute, I'm watching it on CBS now. Where are you?" "Clay, they're calling it Bloody Sunday." "Now, honey, this is just a story on the women. Remember, you don't have to be in the front lines. Just stay back safe with the women." I could have killed him, but how was he to know? And in that moment, I had a brand new thought. I'm all alone. There's no one with me. There's no one who will never leave me alone. And that's true for everybody else here. And it was that first glimpse of mortality, but I was pretty young for that. I was only 32. And that led to my writing passages. I went back and started reading transcripts from a book I'd been writing about couples and their crises. And I noticed that among people in their late 30s to mid 40s, they often had similar kinds of feelings from the inside, feelings of disequilibrium, disappointment with the path they'd been on, you know, an urge to do something different, be something more, change, but they didn't know how, but they felt a tremendous sense of urgency, time running out, mortality again. And I began to think, you know, maybe there are predictable crises along the way. Maybe we continue to grow and develop through adult life. And there are certain points where we have almost predictable points, times of transition. Well, I found out who was writing about this. There were 3 men who were researching adult development, and they were all studying only other men. Because at that time, there was only one life cycle, the male life cycle. And women just had to weave and dodge around it. So I proposed to one of these professors that I suss out the female life cycle. He said, "That sounds right." He said, because by the time women get on the A to B to C to D, which he thought had to be in a nice linear line, probably everything has gone so haywire, their marriages come apart. And I had to tell Clay something take the biggest dare of my life, actually, because I loved this man and he loved me. But I was writing for his magazine and then rushing home in time to bathe and feed and read to my daughter, and then hustling to get ready by 8 o'clock, all dressed to the nines, to go out with Clay, because he was Mr. New York. He had to go to every opening, sports event, dinner party, and he wanted me to go with him. There was no time to think and write about something that was as dense as writing about this subject. So I told him I would have to move out and find a separate place to live so I could concentrate on this book. I didn't want to lose him, but I couldn't. I had to leave my mentor at a certain point. Everybody does. He didn't like it, but he understood it. And actually, we lived apart for 3 years. We saw each other intermittently. I didn't like it when he would come over having had dinner with Barbra Streisand, but we managed our way through it, and if we hadn't, it would have blown up. So we finally did get married in 1984, and people said, our friends said, "What took you so long?" Well, you see, it was really because, I mean, there was no other, well, you'd have to read the book. So I finally finished the book, went to lunch at the Four Seasons with my publisher, and he said, "What is the title? We've been waiting up until the last minute. What are we going to call this thing?" I thought, and suddenly came to me, I said, "Passages." He said, "What? They'll think it means excerpts." I said, "Not when they read the book." And I fought for that title right to the end, and I'm glad I did. So at the same time as Clay and I were getting ready to get married, we made a pre-nuptial trip to Southeast Asia, and we were sitting on the veranda of the Oriental Hotel, one of the great hotels in the world, and we were having breakfast and watching the barges move down the Klong and all the beautiful vegetation. And Clay was reading the Bangkok Post, and I was kind of brooding because he knew I was heartsick because my daughter, Maura, was going off to college, and we'd really never had a family all together. And all of a sudden he said, "Well, maybe there's a child for you here." I said, "What?" I'd never thought of an adoption, certainly not a foreign adoption. And he told me about children who were the survivors of Khmer Rouge, who had made it somehow to the border and now were shut up in refugee camps in Thailand. They couldn't go back to Cambodia because it was now occupied by the Vietnamese communists, and they couldn't come to America because President Reagan's administration had closed the pipeline for Southeast Asian refugees, and Europe had followed suit. So I thought about it for about an hour and said, "We have to go to the camps." He said, "On our last day, our last romantic day?" I said, "Well, you started it." So we got in a bus, we traveled 5 hours to the border, but we couldn't get into the camps because there had been kidnappings. So we flew back to New York, and from JFK, I called the editor of the New York Times Magazine and said, "I want to do a story on the refugees America forgot." He said, "Well, that means going to Cambodia. That's a very expensive trip." And I said, "Well, I'll pay for half of it because I think this is a story we need to do." So a week later, I'm back in a refugee camp in Thailand, and now I have my reporter's hat on, and I've lined up 6 kids from different backgrounds to interview. And there's one girl who's been following me around the camp. I could just see her eyes behind the bamboo fence and following me around. And all of a sudden, she appeared beautifully in a sarong, her hair freshly washed, and her head held high. And I knew she hadn't submitted to the identity of refugee. She still had her own self-pride. She came in, and the first question I asked her was, "Have you ever known a happy time?" And her whole demeanor changed because, of course, nobody had had the time to ask such a frivolous question. And she began telling me about the little White House in Phnom Penh with the bougainvillea and her father leaving on a motorbike to go to work. I think he was an MP, and her mother teaching her Chinese because her mother was Chinese, half Chinese, and taking care of her younger siblings. And towards the end of the interview, I had to ask how her family had disappeared one by one, and she started to tell me this terrible story, and tears came to the edge of her eyelids, and she put her head down so we wouldn't see her crying. The translator and I kind of massaged her back. We could feel her sobs, but we couldn't see anything until she composed herself completely and came back to lock onto my eyes. And by that time, I had fallen in love with her. And when the interview was over, we walked out of the tent, and suddenly I was surrounded and crushed by people handing me letters to the U.S. Embassy, which they knew would otherwise be destroyed. "Please help us." And this little girl disappeared back, and I had to call out, "What's your name?" Mom. M-O-M. That was the name that had been given to her by her family so that the Khmer Rouge wouldn't know that she was a member of the intelligentsia. So I got back to New York. I wrote a letter to Mom at Sakeo refugee camp, Bangkok. Never had any idea if it got to her. She wrote a letter to me saying she'd like to come to America. She didn't know if I ever got it. I managed to get an adoption agency to agree to go against the rules and help me bring her out. A few months later, they went out of business. And then our American former ambassador to Cambodia let me know that the Reagan administration was going to punish me for writing op-eds about our refugee policy by not letting me bring this child out. So I pretty much gave up hope. And then one day, literally almost 9 months later, I was coming in from a jog in the park, and I pushed my answering machine, and there was the message, Mom, coming on JFK tomorrow night, 8:30 p.m. Just like the stork. So I got in my little Volkswagen with my sister and the former ambassador. We're driving to the airport, and I said, I have to bring her something. So I stop at a Chinese restaurant to get rice, and the former Cambodian ambassador says, Cambodians hate Chinese rice. But we got to the airport, and this beautiful little girl, 12 years old, comes off the plane, little tiny arms and legs, holding a plastic bag with her worldly possessions in it. In the bottom of it was a little red purse, and inside, my letter all folded up. She also had a map of the United States with New York yellowed in. That's all she knew. And she looked at people who looked like you, with light skin, light hair, light eyes. Nobody looked like anybody she'd ever seen before. And she had gotten on a plane in Bangkok, gone to Tokyo, stopped in Seattle, stopped in Chicago, letting off other children. She'd seen sunrise, sunset, sunrise, sunset. She thought she'd landed on another planet. And for the first few weeks, we had to gently let her become part of New York City. I would hear her going to sleep at night, rehearsing the words you need to survive in New York City. Bus, subway, taxi, dollar. And 6 months later, she was dictating stories to me for her English class in English. And she grew up to go to Wellesley College and become an artist. So that was one of Clay and I adopted her together. And at the same time as she came into our life, Tina Brown came into my life. She came over from England and became the editor of Vanity Fair magazine. And she asked me if I would like to write character portraits of presidential candidates and ultimately of world leaders. So I cut my teeth on Gary Hart, which was pretty exciting. And then I wrote about both the Clintons and both Presidents Bush, and Newt Gingrich was one of the most interesting ones. But to write about Prime Minister Thatcher, I actually subjected myself to an electrical bath. Well, she was in her 10th year as Prime Minister, on the top of her game, but she looked 20 years younger than when she took office. So what was the secret of her rejuvenation? Well, I found out she was a shameless flirt. What? She actually surrounded herself by cabinet ministers, she called them her star boys, who all looked like 1930s American matinee idols. And one of them told me, oh yes, he said, we find Mrs. T sexually attractive in a rather packaged way. This was done by Risco. It was the description that President Mitterrand gave of Margaret Thatcher. He said, she had the lips of Marilyn Monroe and the eyes of Caligula. But still, my friends would say, Thatcher's sexy, come on, please. The Soviet press called her the Iron Lady. Well, I discovered she relied on an imperious Indian woman who called herself Madame Veronique. And she had some very Tony clients. Pamela Harriman was our ambassador at that time and a member of the royal family. Her identity was closely guarded, and so I had to take on a false persona to be admitted to her inner sanctum, whereupon she directed me to disrobe and climb up the steps to the top of her electrical bath. And she was at the other end manipulating the current to recharge the nervous system. Well, I'm standing there shivering, not from cold, from fear, thinking, I've done a lot of things to get a story, but maybe electrocution is going too far. My dear, I have had kings and princes and little bitty emirs in that tub. Step in. So I stepped in, and she shook salts. I allowed myself to be parboiled for the next hour, but I got the best insight into Margaret Thatcher, because she told me that there was a romantic attraction between Misha Gorbachev and Mrs. Thatcher. Well, I was able, after 47 interviews with people around Margaret Thatcher, to awaken her curiosity on what they'd all said, so she granted me an interview. And in it, she was proud to tell me that she was the first Western leader to spot Gorbachev as a different kind of Soviet. And she had invited him to London when he was only a provincial party boss. She took him to Chequers, and they spent the whole night into the wee hours of the morning downing vodkas and brandies and ignoring their food. And Maggie then questioned Gorbachev about his wishes, and he said he insisted that Russians were European, and he wanted Europe to take them seriously. And she said, nonsense! You'll never be taken seriously as European as long as you have that terrible Iron Curtain. It's archaic. Well, Gorbachev then asked her to explain how Great Britain had let go of its colonies and still maintained a status as a world power. Well, now Thatcher knew she had her hooks into him, so she began to tutor him, and he listened very attentively. And she came out to the world afterwards and said, I like Mr. Gorbachev. We can do business together. You might remember her saying that. Well, he was subsequently named leader of the Soviet Union, and he invited his new best friend to Moscow. And Mrs. T had aqua scutum completely revamp her wardrobe, lift the hems because she had very nice legs, and lower the décolleté. And her meetings with Gorbachev were described by the press as passionate. They spent the next 18 hours together, and I was able to observe them. He took her to the Bolshoi. They left in the middle of the first act. We're talking in the corridor. He had a banquet for her at the Kremlin, lots and lots of people. They only had eyes for each other. And finally, Thatcher was able to get back to her other heartthrob, Ronnie, President Reagan, and she told him that Gorbachev could be persuaded to let go of Eastern Europe peacefully. And it was then that Reagan was able to go to Berlin and say, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall. And that was the beginning of the end of the Cold War, with some thanks to Margaret Thatcher. Oh, and by the way, my story was debated in the House of Commons. Mrs. Thatcher's baths earned her a new sobriquet, the Iron Lady. Well, now it's 1992. It's the night of the Literary Lions Gala. Writers and editors and publishers all gather at the New York Public Library and climb its high steps. Awardees will be draped in red sashes and medals. Bill Styron is one of them, Maya Angelou, and I'm even among them. So I'm floating up the stairs by the man who sculpted my career, and people are calling out, Clay, Clay, because everybody knew him. He had launched the careers of so many people, countless writers, editors, and art directors. But tonight, he was taking pride in being with one of the new literary lions, and I'm happy, but I'm also sick with fear. I can't stop thinking about where we were a few hours before in a cramped examining room with an imperious surgeon who rolled on his stool toward Clay and said, radical neck surgery, it's your only option. I said, what? There's never only one option. What is he talking about? And then he said to Clay, I need your full consent. And Clay said, well, full consent for what? What does that mean? He said, to do whatever is necessary. Primary tumor, not visible. It may be necessary, take voice box, even if not involved with cancer. What? Clay without a voice? Unthinkable.
Out of that, I say to young writers, I said, you know, no, you've got to invest in your own career. Nobody else is going to do it. Spend the time, spend the money, and, you know, work late at night, because that's the way you get ahead. Make sure.
So we sought a second consult and a third until we found an oncologist who agreed to be our medical quarterback. And by that, we meant we were asking him to help us pick the team, because there's always multiple doctors. And then there are non-medical, integrative people, nutritionists, massage therapists to deal with the injuries after treatment, because there always are. And it's an investment in time and trouble that I highly recommend. It's not easy to find a medical quarterback, but if you find somebody who will stay with you throughout the whole process, it makes all the difference in the world. Well, we were fortunate. The toad of cancer crouching at the back of Clay's throat was found and cut out early. And we were buoyant with victory because we felt we were partners in fighting for life. Well, 2 years later, 1993, there was another diagnosis, this time non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. It was indolent, and the doctor, who was quite a humanistic person, said, no drug will improve your lifespan at this point, so I'm going to leave you alone. We said, does that mean giving up? And he said, no. He said, I'm going to give you a real prescription. What I want you to do is go out and do something wonderful together that you wouldn't have done without this crisis, and do it together. Well, that was the best prescription we'd ever had. So we made a commitment to take long meditative walks, and we'd take them in Central Park or the Nature Conservancy, or even sometimes get out to big sky country. And the purpose was for Clay to wrestle with the next great existential question. What was it about his work that he most loved, stripped of title and setting? What could give him the excitement and sense of purpose that he'd always had in his work? Well, it took him almost a year. And then he suddenly one day had an aha moment. I know what I love. I love to identify and shape young talent. I said, well, great, then you could be a teacher. He said, but I don't want to occupy some stuffy academic chair. And I said, but the University of California, Berkeley Journalism School wants you to come out and actually show students how to make magazines. Well, all we had to do was tear up the lives we'd spent 30 years building in the world of New York publishing, and move to the other side of the country and start over. Well, in California, we were young again. We were in love again. We were starting over. And together we found a new purpose in giving back to a new generation of journalists. We had grandkids. We had a wonderful tropical garden, nothing like we'd ever had in the East. And it turned out they were 10 of our happiest years. Clay launched a number of journalists into New York Times and starting their own magazines. And I wrote 5 more books. And guess what? Clay's lymphoma never came back. But ultimately, his original cancer returned. And at one point, a doctor told me, your husband has entered the cycle of slow dying. That was one of the worst phrases I'd ever heard. So in late June 2008, Clay's body began to shut down. And Clay asked the doctor, how long? The doctor said, not long, days to a week. Do you want to do something wonderful, sweetheart? His eyes lit up. Said, jazz. Now he couldn't speak very well because of all the radiation on his throat. Yes. I said, Dizzy's Coca-Cola Club? Now he really looks smiling. So I ran to the phone, called Dizzy's. It was a Monday night. I didn't think they'd have a show, but they did. I ran back and said, they have a show starting in 2 hours. Do you think we can make it? And then, with all the energy that he had left, miraculously, he pushed himself up from the wheelchair, from the hospital bed in the middle of our study, and pushed himself over to the wheelchair and got himself to his wardrobe and pulled out a nice linen jacket and a blue shirt and a cap, and he let me push him to the mirror and put some tinted sunscreen on his face so it would give him some color. And I said, "How's that for handsome?" And he looked pleased, because it was a look of near normal. And we got ourselves to Dizzy's Coca-Cola Club, the quintessence of New York, floor-to-ceiling windows with a view across Central Park. You could see the lights of the East Side. A full moon was crossing the sky. And Clay's attention locked on the jazz pianist, a man of about his age, who said, "There's a lot of pessimism out there, feelings of futility. It's the job of music to dispel those feelings." And so he played an original composition called "Life is What You Make It." And that was our motto. So the drums kick-started an up-tempo piece. Clay was a drummer as a boy, so I asked the waiter to bring him some swizzle sticks, and he began drumming on the table. And he sat up straight in his wheelchair. For the next 2 hours, he drummed on the table, and he was a drummer again. He was a boy again. We didn't get home until midnight, and then he found his voice, and he gripped my hand, and he said, "That was a magical evening." And 2 days later, he died in my arms. Well, the end of Clay's life wasn't the end of my life. I've dared to write again. I've dared to love again. And I'm still here.